Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beeker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule for these series is available on our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding for the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. At 4 miles long, the Kansas-Nebraska Railroad was once the shortest interstate railroad in the United States. Our speaker today is Lincolnite Richard Schmeling, a retired lawyer and rail fan. Rich's presentation will tell the story of this short but busy cement plant rail line. Richard?
Thank you, and I must say I'm gratified to see that a number of you turned up on this day. It's always nice to have a good group to present to, and I think there'll be some of you that may have some questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer those questions. I'll give you the formal presentation, and then we'll go from there to some questions and answers. First of all, how many of you people have ever been to Superior, Nebraska? Just a show of hands. Oh, good. Oh, that's great. Okay, super. How many of you, when you were in Superior, saw the little interstate railroad? Nobody. That's not surprising. I'm a lifelong student of railroads and railroad history, and I can tell you that a railroad like this little railroad often was overlooked. And there were a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons, of course, was the fact that if you look at a map of the state of Nebraska, Superior isn't exactly right in the center of things. I have a map up here which is not too well lit, and I'm going to just simply refer to it briefly. This map right here shows the location of the railroad in Superior. Superior, to just sort of orient you, is southeast of Hastings, Nebraska. I was visiting with a gentleman, and he's from Clay Center, which is not too far away from Superior. It nestles right on the Nebraska-Kansas border. So it's a little bit off the beaten track insofar as normal travel and visitors are concerned. The plant itself was not located in the town. The plant was located approximately 2 miles west of town, and so if you went to Superior for a band concert or a family reunion or something like that, if you weren't out cruising the countryside, you might not have stumbled across the cement plant. The plant itself was a busy place for safety reasons. Access was not prohibited, but it was somewhat discouraged. So if you were in that area, you might have been able to drive past the plant and see it from the outside, but there weren't a lot of people that had access to the plant on the inside unless you had some sort of business. Maury Tuttle, you don't get to answer this question, neither do you, Jim Reisdorf, but does anybody know what we mean when we talk about a standard gauge railroad? Yes, sir.
Well, it's a certain width.
That's right. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. 4 feet, 8.5 inches from inside of one rail to the inside of the other rail.
And what's a narrow gauge, though?
Narrow gauge would then be usually 3 feet In Europe, you have some meter gauge, which would be 39.37 inches. You've got some 2-foot gauge railroads, some of which are preserved in the state of Maine. But the standard gauge in the United States and in Great Britain and throughout Europe is 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Interestingly enough, that particular phenomenon occurred because the early railroads were basically adaptations of horse carts, and they carved little grooves in the stone to keep the wagons going, and the horse would pull it along. And the standard width of the wagons in Great Britain at that time was 4 feet, 8.5 inches from wheel to wheel. So we just sort of, you know, by gosh and by golly, we arrived at what was called standard gauge. This railroad that we're talking about today, the Nebraska-Kansas Railroad, was in fact a standard gauge railroad. Its track width was such that it could accept cars from any of the other railroads, and its cars and engines could travel on any of the other railroads in the United States. Standard gauge, of course. The idea was that in order to have a good, viable railroad system in the United States, you needed to have some sort of standardization. The Russians, as a defense measure, purposely made their railroads a wider gauge. And when the Germans invaded Russia, they had a devil of a time because their freight cars and engines wouldn't fit on the Russian railroads because the track width was different. But other than that, pretty much standard 4 feet, 8.5 inches. So we can't really probably talk about the railroad without talking about the whole idea of why the railroad was there, and that was to manufacture cement. Now, we get into some terminology differences, and I want to kind of clear that up right away because I think it's important. When you people drove from wherever you came from to the Historical Society, you traveled on a bunch of surfaces. Some of those surfaces were concrete. Okay? Cement and concrete are related, but they're not the same. In order to make a concrete driveway, foundation, pavement, whatever, you have to use cement. The cement is one of the raw materials that goes into concrete construction. If you were to try to make it out of cement alone, it wouldn't be a very satisfactory solution because cement, as it is in its raw form before it is mixed, is just gray powder. It's not very, if you'll pardon the expression, concrete. So what we do when we get to the point where we use the cement, we mix it with water and we mix it with some other form of aggregate. That could be sand, it could be gravel, it could be smaller rocks, pellets, whatever, and you mix all of those together in a cement mixer of some sort, and you end up with a very slurry substance that you then pour in forms, and you have the concrete. So how do we get the cement? Well, now we're going to get into geology and history and so on and so forth, because this is kind of the origins of all of this business. As many of you know, we had glacial action on the North American continent, where glaciers came down from the Arctic area and moved very slowly, ponderously across this area of the Great Plains. That glacial movement then came to a halt, and it stopped essentially in the area of northern Kansas. Didn't go down into Oklahoma or Texas. As the glacier moved along, it picked up a whole bunch of residue. And this residue was everything from plant life to animal life to even some sea creatures. As many of you know from studying Nebraska history, Nebraska was once a vast ocean, an inland ocean. The glaciers that moved along picked up this debris and moved it southward, and then when the glacier came to a halt, this stuff was just sort of left there. As a result, if you travel in southern Nebraska, and more notably in northern Kansas, what you encounter is large formations of what we call limestone. And limestone, one of the components of which is calcium carbonate, is a base ingredient for making cement. The area south of Superior, just across the Nebraska-Kansas state line, that area had just vast quantities of limestone deposits. I don't want to mislead you. Limestone is not uncommon. You find it throughout the world. But that area of northern Kansas was very rich in limestone. The limestone essentially was formed from all of this debris, the ocean life, the plants, various other things. So what we have is an area around Superior that has large quantities of limestone. You get down into northern Kansas, you'll find entire structures built of that limestone. Schoolhouses, country farms, just any number of structures. It's not particularly hard stone. It's not something that's going to endure, but at least it was there and it was available locally, and it was such that it was used quite a bit with the building. Then you ask yourself, well, Superior, Nebraska is sort of out in the middle of nowhere. Why would we build a cement plant in Superior? Well, we have to think back. We're talking about turn of the century now, going from the 1800s to the 1900s. At this point in time, the mass immigration in Nebraska has pretty much tapered off to some extent, and we have a bunch of permanent settlers. The early settlers we know often lived in lean-tos, log cabins, fairly simple construction. But as people got there and as towns developed and infrastructure was being built, pretty soon we decided we needed some more imposing type structures, something that would be more durable and last longer. And so we started getting not just simple little one-story buildings, but we started getting two-story buildings, even three-story buildings, and some taller than that. And part of the technology necessary for building like that was to have cement. So the local people in Superior, along with some entrepreneurs from the Omaha and Lincoln area, decided that there would be a demand for cement, and that we had the raw material right there in the southern part of Nebraska, northern part of Kansas. And the reason Superior was selected was, again, we have to think turn of the century. We're not talking about a highway system that was highly developed. We're not talking about motor vehicles that were large or reliable. The major way of moving during that point in time was by railroad, and Superior happened to have a large conglomeration of various railroads. We had the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad main line, which connected Kansas City and Denver, going right through Superior. There was a Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy branch line that went north from Superior to Edgar, Nebraska, and connected with other Burlington lines in the area. There was a connection between Red Cloud, Nebraska, and Hastings, Nebraska. That's just one railroad. Then we had the Missouri Pacific Railroad that was built from Concordia, Kansas, up to Hastings and onward eventually to Prosser, Nebraska. And that went right through Superior. We had the Santa Fe Railroad, which came up from Kansas, and the only town in Nebraska served by the Santa Fe was Superior, Nebraska. Then coming down from Fremont, Nebraska, we had the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, and that line terminated in Superior. The Santa Fe and the Northwestern Railroads were kissing cousins. They shared a joint yard, joint engine facilities, and they had a lot of commonality. So we had a lot of good rail transportation in Superior. So once we manufactured the cement, it would be fairly easy to move it wherever we wanted to, essentially throughout the United States, anywhere the trains could take the cement. Prior to the construction of the plant in Superior, all the cement that was used in this area was brought in from other states, Iowa and Kansas. And they did some marketing analysis, and they found there were 9 million tons of cement being imported into the state of Nebraska. And essentially they said, you know, there's enough demand here that if we build the plant in Superior, we'll be able to probably have it available at a lower price. So that's why Superior was selected. Another reason Superior was selected was it's along the Republican River. And we could spend an entire hour, which I won't do today, talking about the Republican River and exactly what it is. Suffice it to say that the Republican River today is far different than it was back during the time that we're going to be talking about. A bunch of dams have been constructed to control flooding, and the river today resembles more the Platte River with a bunch of sandbars and not very deep stream flow. Whereas when I was growing up in Superior, it was a deep, fast-running river and had a lot of water and was very prone to flooding. So we had an abundant water supply. The powers that be, and I'm not going to bore you with the long corporate history, but the powers that be formed the Superior Portland Cement Company. And they started organizing around 1909. By about 1911 or 1912, they started erecting buildings at the site of what was going to be the new cement plant. And because the plant was across the river in Nebraska and the limestone was over in the north side of Kansas, there had to be a way to get the limestone from where it was being taken out of the ground to the cement plant in Superior. That's where our railroad comes into play. Again, we've got to remember roads during that period of time were primitive. They were unpaved. They were subject to problems with rain during the warmer parts of the year, snow blockage during the winter. They weren't very good, reliable. They weren't all-weather roads. And the vehicles that were traveling on them were primitive. The trucks were small with small capacity. So a railroad made a lot of sense. So starting in about 1914, in 1913, they were working on a bridge that would cross the Republican River and end up right on the north bank of the river at the site of the cement plant. That bridge was completed, and then they built the railroad south into Kansas. And the original quarry was located to the east of what the later quarries were where the later quarries were sited. So it was a little over 3 miles from the plant in Nebraska to the railroad, to the quarry where the railroad got its rock. And this railroad, essentially, although there were a few little minor variations, this railroad for its entire life, the 72 years of the existence of the cement plant and of the railroad, it hauled basically that limestone rock. Okay, so how do we get the limestone rock to become cement? Well, the limestone formations in the quarry in the northern part of Kansas were essentially soft rock but chunky, and they tended to be in great big tall faces. Fortunately for the cement plant people, there was very little topsoil over the limestone. The stuff on top is called overburden. And I think we know enough about minerals and mining that we know in Pennsylvania and Virginia and West Virginia, in order to get to what you need to use, you need to dig a mine shaft and go deep. This was not that kind of an operation. This was basically scraping the clay that was on top of these deep mammoth rock deposits, scraping the clay off and then loosening the rock. In the early years, the way they did this was they drilled holes and put dynamite in there, and then they would blast, and this would result in huge chunks of that limestone peeling off the face of the quarry and going down to the floor, where it could be then picked up by steam shovels and loaded in railroad cars and hauled to the plant. The early operations resulted in pretty big chunks of limestone. So when the limestone got to the cement plant, what they had to do was they had to run it through something called a crusher. And a crusher is essentially just what the name implies. It takes those big hunks of limestone and breaks them into smaller chunks. That was stage one. We take the limestone from the quarry to the cement plant, we dump it, it goes through the crusher. Then from that point, the smaller rocks were elevated into a ball mill. The ball mill essentially has a bunch of ball bearings in it, and as you might imagine from what we're talking about, the ball bearings were huge. So you pour the rock in the top of the ball mill, and there's a spiral circular path, and the rock and the balls go down the path together, and in the process, the limestone rock is crushed further, so it becomes fairly small. From there, we take that finer limestone and we put it in kilns. These kilns initially were fired by coal. Along about 1938, 39, around in there, Kansas-Nebraska Gas Company built a gas pipeline north to Superior and ran an extension out to the cement plant. From that point on, these great big, huge drums, kilns, were then fired by gas, at least most of the year. Now, we take that crushed up rock, we put it inside the kilns, and we're talking about a tremendous amount of heat. We're talking about 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot. You can roast a lot of hot dogs in heat like that. This mixture was cooked, and then as a result of this cooking, the moisture came out of the limestone. Limestone is fairly porous, so it had moisture in it. The moisture came out of the limestone, and we ended up with something that in the cement manufacturing trade is known as clinker. Clinker was very small. It was gray in color. The clinker was then taken from the kilns and taken to another mill where again it went through a process of rolling and so on and so forth, and we end up with the gray powdery stuff that we find when we open a bag of cement. So that's the basic process that we're talking about. The cement plant in Superior operated 24 hours a day, 7 days per week, 365 days a year. And so it was necessary for this railroad to keep a supply of limestone on the way from the quarry to the cement plant all the time. The actual operation used for the most part, and we can nitpick it and we can do a lot of yeah, but and so on and so forth. But basically what we had two trains. One was at the plant dumping loads of rock into the crusher. The other was at the quarry being loaded by steam shovels. And I'm going to refer you to this picture that's closest to me. That's a picture from the quarry from the early years, 1915, around in there. And you see a giant steam shovel. And it was, in fact, as the name implies, it was powered by steam. There was a crane operator on it, and then there was a fireman to shovel the coal in the firebox. And that shovel then would take that rock that had been loosened by the blasting, pick it up, and put it in the rock cars. You can see the rock cars being loaded, the big steam shovel, smoke coming out of the top of the steam shovel. You can see the little engine there on the end of the cars, and these are very early rock cars. There are little dump things on top of the rock cars, and they are loaded with what we call skips, those dump things being flat. Once we get to the crusher, the crusher crew attaches a hook to an iPad on each individual crusher, and then they pull it to a 45-degree angle from flat, and the limestone hopefully all falls out and goes down into the maw of the crusher. As I mentioned, these cars are very early cars, 3 skips. As time went along, the cars got bigger. They were longer, the skips were of greater volume, and there were more cars per train. This little engine that we see here has 1, 2, 3 cars. By the time we get to the end of the railroad operation, we're up to 6 cars, we're up to 5 skips per car. So we're talking about a lot of rock on the move. Now we need to digress just for a moment and talk about 2 ways of making cement. I've described the basic process, but there's the wet process and the dry process. With the dry process, what you do is before you fire the stuff in the kilns, you mix in certain additives. The additives varied with the type of cement that you wanted to end up with. Some of the additives that would have been used would have been clay, and that clay usually came from the quarry, the overburden, and then there would be some silica that was shipped in from some point in the United States that would be added. There was some iron from time to time, powderized iron that was added, and all of this would have to be blended. The dry process involved having little chutes of all of this stuff around, and then opening it and measuring a quantity of the dry stuff, and then trying to get it to mix all together before it was put in the kiln. The plant started out as a dry process plant. The early production in 1914, 15, 1916 was pretty unsatisfactory. They had a lot of difficulty getting that dry mix so that it was mixed right and so that things were proportionate to produce the type of cement that they wanted. In about 1919, a big change took place. All of a sudden, an industrialist from Denver by the name of Charles Becherer, B-O-E-T-T-C-H-E-R, Charles Becherer, became interested in the plant in Superior. He was an entrepreneur, and he already had some cement plants in Colorado that he had acquired, and he was operating them. He looked at Superior and said, you know, if I buy that plant in Superior, it gives me a plant further east than my other plants, and this area looks fairly promising. So Becherer essentially bought out the local investors and owned the cement plant in Superior. At that time, his chain was known as Ideal Cement Company. Ideal. And the Superior plant continued to operate under that name of Ideal Cement for most of its existence. Becherer had looked at the operation in Superior and said, you know, this isn't really working. We need to make some changes. So what he did was he went ahead and he changed from the dry process to the wet process. In the wet process, you used water out of that wonderful Republican River that was nearby, and you mixed in the limestone, powdery limestone, the various aggregates, the silica, the iron, whatever, the clay, and you created what's known as a slurry. And the slurry allowed those basic ingredients to mix much more uniformly and evenly than the dry process. So that was what went into the kilns in Superior. And of course, with the tremendous heat in the kilns, the moisture baked out of it, and you ended up with the clinker, which was pretty well mixed and pretty pure. So the plant really took off. Starting along about 1919, production was more uniform, the quality was better, and the Superior plant developed a reputation for having a good quality product of cement. This meant that more cement was being sold, and this also meant that the railroad was busier than ever. The railroad itself underwent changes through the years, and it's thoroughly discussed in my book. Interestingly, it started out as an electric railroad, and I'm going to refer you to the furthest photograph over there. I'm going to go over and point out something to you, and then I'll come back to the microphone. Notice this funny little thing right here? That's an electric engine. You can see its trolley pole going up to overhead electric wires. And here's the steam shovel working away. So there was during this period of time when this railroad was being built, there were a lot of notions about modernizing railroads by using electric power rather than steam power. And the Superior entrepreneurs were right on top of the curve. They thought it would be good to have an electric engine to haul the limestone from the quarry to the cement plant. So what they did was they bought, brand new from Westinghouse, this funny little engine that you see in that photograph. And it was number 100. Now, they didn't have 100 engines, but I guess they decided to start at 100 and work up from there. So that little electric engine came to Superior, and they put up poles all the way from the cement plant to the quarry and strung electric wire. And then the trolley pole on top of the little electric engine would draw current and was able to move up and down the track. In addition, some of the tracks within the cement plant were also equipped with those electric wires so the little electric engine could move and do switching within the plant. That experiment worked to a point. However, although the little electric engine had an easy time pulling the empty cars from the cement plant south across the border to the quarry, when the cars were loaded and the little engine would take them back downgrade toward the cement plant, the little engine wasn't able to hold the cars back. There were no air brakes on those cars at that time, and it was up to the engine to hold them from going lickety-split down the grade. So at some point in time, the powers that be said, okay, this was not such a good idea. Maybe we better go back to the old technology. At that point, they purchased a series of small steam locomotives. One of the engines, engine number 3, was brand new. The others were secondhand. They'd worked for various other enterprises throughout the United States, and they were picked up on the used engine market. So we ended up with basically 4 engines, numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. These little engines were the main source of propulsion for the railroad up until about 1947. Starting in 1947, we started getting some bigger engines. Again, we're talking about second-hand engines. One of the engines came from one of the Becherer cement plants in Fort Collins, Colorado. And it had been used out there, and it was surplus to their needs, so it was transferred to Superior. Another engine came from the U.S. Navy. It was one of the many engines that was built to shuttle boxcars around on the piers during World War II, and once the war ended, those engines there were too many of them, they didn't need them all, and so here was a bargain, so we snapped that one up. The engine from Becherer, Colorado was number 5, and the engine from the U.S. Navy was number 97. Then, along about 1952, we inherited an engine from one of the other Becherer plants down in Arkansas, and that one was number 26. And it was a big engine. It was the biggest engine they ever ran. It weighed 140,000 pounds. So we went from 4 little steam engines to ending up with 3 larger steam engines. And then, as most of you know, concerning the change in railroading, at some point in time, the various railroads settled upon diesel-electric locomotives. And in the early 1950s, the first diesel-electric locomotive was purchased for the cement plant. It was numbered 005. No connection with James Bond, but it was a little Porter engine, and it was strong enough to actually haul rock trains back and forth from the quarry to the cement plant. Shortly thereafter, they acquired another engine, engine number 2. And engine number 2 wasn't very powerful, and it could only move about 4 rock cars, so it was kind of consigned to switching out in the quarry, to moving cars around out there. Then we bought a used engine from the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which had been the Superior switch engine. It became number 3. And then as time went along, we ended up getting a couple of U.S. military surplus engines. These were what we call 44-tonner center cab engines, and one was ex-U.S. Air Force and the other was ex-U.S. Army. The interesting thing to me was that here you had all the major railroads in the Superior area using diesel electric, and here's the cement plant, and they still, as late as January of 1960, they still had an operating steam engine in use. Just really kind of a neat thing from my standpoint as a rail fan. Eventually, the last steam engine to be used, number 97, was put out to pasture, and the line continued to its final operations with those various diesel electrics. Now, if you were to go to Superior today and go 2 miles west of town, you'd see a few tall silos, but these silos essentially are not from cement manufactured in Superior. That entire cement plant with all of its buildings, the kilns, the crusher, the ball mills, all of that, gone completely. Completely obliterated. The railroad is no longer there. If you know where to look, you can still find some traces of it. But in 1986, the cement plant in Superior was essentially shut down. Why? Well, the corporate structure changed. As long as Mr. Becherer was in charge, Superior was a valued operation. And then there was a merger where Becherer decided he'd start dabbling in potash. And so instead of Ideal Cement Company, it became Ideal Basic Industries, the cement and the potash. And then we had another change where a Swedish conglomerate bought the whole operation, Holnam. And all of a sudden you went from having a locally organized, a locally funded cement plant to just one of many plants owned by a foreign conglomerate. And I don't know, I suppose maybe somebody from that conglomerate journeyed to Superior, Nebraska at some point in time, but the decision-making went from local to across the seas, and this was just one of many cement plants. In 1986, it was one of two of the oldest plants in the system. It had been built in the teens, and although there were modifications that were made to try to make it more efficient, it essentially was what it had been. It was an old plant. There were a bunch of newer plants. All of the newer plants, interestingly enough, used the dry process. The reason that they could use the dry process was that with computerization and modern blending techniques, you could get a uniform product using the dry process as opposed to the wet process. Superior remained with the wet process and used that process through the date of its closure. The decision was made to close the plant in October of 1986. The last of the rock trains ran from the quarry to the cement plant, and essentially from that point on, it was shut down and tear down. Today in Superior, cement comes from another plant in Ada, Oklahoma, is put in storage silos, and Superior still serves as a distribution point, but the cement that goes out of Superior isn't manufactured in Superior. I can't even begin to cover the book in terms of the time that I have allotted to me, but there are some neat stories. And I'll tell you one of them. The little steam engines, of course, had whistles, and they blew the whistles to warn people that the train was on the move. Well, little old engine number 3 had a very high-pitched, shrill whistle. And one day, the crew was moving that engine around in the yards, and they blew the whistle, and the whistle stuck open. They could not get it to shut off. Well, Richard Kistler, my friend from Superior, said that everybody in the cement plant village, the little town out there where the cement plant had cottages for the employees, everybody came out of their houses and started going down toward the cement plant, because usually when you heard a whistle like that, it meant that there was something terrible happening. And so they wanted to find out what was going on. Well, the crew was frantic. They got on top of the engine, and they took hammers and they banged away at that whistle to try to get the valve to unseat so it would quit blowing. And they couldn't do anything. And it blew and it blew and it blew, and more people gathered. Well, finally they hit upon a solution. They opened the cocks on the boiler, and all the steam went out of the boiler, and once the pressure went down, why, the whistle quit blowing. But kind of a neat little story. The interesting thing to me is that This operation was a dangerous operation, and there was a potential for serious mishap. There were never any fatalities on that railroad during the 72 years that the railroad operated. During that entire period of time, there were some personal injuries, but never fatalities. And that's a real tribute to the men that operated those trains. Now, let's imagine that we're here in the cement plant on the bank of the Republican River. We go across a tall trestle across the Republican, and then we go downgrade, and we're down in the Republican River Valley for about 2 miles. And then as we near the quarry in Kansas, we go climbing up through the bluffs and up to the quarry, which is elevated. That's a very steep grade coming out of the quarry. The thing that you worried about was a train getting loose and banging into another train. There was an instance, and this was probably the most serious accident. We had a rock car that became uncoupled from, a loaded rock car became uncoupled from a train coming down out of the quarry, and the empty train was coming along the track, not expecting to see anything in their way. And that loaded rock car came at a pretty good clip, and down in the river valley, the two met. The engineer stayed with his engine. He was right where the rock car hit the engine. The fireman saw it coming and he jumped and he escaped serious injury. The little old engine, unfortunately, got pretty badly banged by the heavy rock car, and it was never repaired and put back into service. But that's the most serious accident that ever happened. It's a wonder that those enginemen weren't killed. It had the potential for high disaster, but fortunately, there were no fatalities and just some injuries. Lot of neat stories from the guys that worked the railroad. Gee-many. It's been quite a few years, and most of those guys are getting pretty old. But one engineer told a story about having a rock train, and he thought he had all the brakes in working order, and he went out of the quarry and went down that steep 2% grade, and the train started gathering speed, and he thought, I better put the brakes on and maybe slow this down a little bit. And he went to work the brakes, and he didn't have any brakes. There was some defect in the air brake system, so as a result, he had a runaway. Fortunately, the other train was out of the way, cleared down at the other end of the railroad, and as he leveled out in the Republican Valley, he was able to let the train sort of coast on its own momentum, and it slowed down. But he said, I was really scared. He said, I was along for the ride, and whatever happened was going to happen, and there wasn't anything I could do to prevent it. The Republican River, I don't have time to cover it, but suffice it to say that Republican River was a nasty river prone to flooding. There were serious floods several times during the existence of the railroad, and the floods were so severe, and there are a lot of flood pictures in the book, but the flooding was so severe that from time to time, large portions of that railroad would be essentially washed out, and they'd have to come in and rebuild it. The only thing that stopped that was the construction of the various dams up along the Republican that sort of changed the Republican River. I knew that this nice little railroad had been featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not. My friend from Superior, Richard Kistler, actually had at one time a copy of that Believe It or Not feature that showed an illustration of the railroad and listed it as America's shortest interstate railroad. I wrote Ripley's Believe It or Not and said, can I get a copy of that and use it in my book? I wrote them one time, twice, 3 times, never got a reply. I have no idea, what remains of the Ripley organization, but obviously the one person that's still tending to their affairs, didn't have time to answer my inquiry. It would be nice to have that included in the book, but we never were able to find one. But it did get momentary fame as America's shortest interstate railroad, as featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not. Now, I've rambled on a long time, and I could go on all afternoon, which most of you can't, but I'm hoping that maybe what I've said will bring some questions forth. So let's go to questions, and I'll try to answer them the best I can. Yes, sir.
Where was the electric generating plant that run the electric railroad?
The cement plant had its own standing electric generating plant that used water from the Republican River. And that powered the electric railroad. It powered the machinery within the cement plant itself. Okay, anybody? Yes?
How did it happen that the entrepreneurs never were successful in getting the CB&Q or the kissing cousins to invest in building a spur to that cement plant?
Okay, well, first of all, we didn't have time to really cover it, but the CB&Q went right through the plant. And they were more interested in the long haul revenue of hauling the cement from Superior to Lincoln, Superior to Chicago, Superior to Fremont, Superior to North Platte. They weren't interested in operating a 4-mile spur. Plus the fact that the railroad being operated by the plant itself, that little short stretch of railroad was more responsive to the needs of the plant than if they'd had to go through the railroad bureaucracy and say, we need to get a train out to the quarry right away because we're running short of rock. So those are the only things I can think to answer you, to answer that question with. But as far as I know, none of the railroads serving Superior were ever approached on the subject, and none of them ever volunteered. Yes, sir.
How many kilns did they have there at the plant?
They started out with 3, they ended up with 4.
Every once in a while, they'd have to shut down and reline one.
You're absolutely correct. 3 online, 1 down for maintenance. And those kilns they had brick, fire brick all the way around them. Over a period of time, that fire brick would deteriorate. They'd have to shut it down, cool it down, and then they'd go inside there and they'd reline it with new brick. So they just alternate, sort of like power plants do with their generators today. Have so many online and 1 down for maintenance. The cement plant, by the way, had a complete machine shop, and they actually fabricated a lot of these rock cars that you'll see in the book. They would take old railroad cars from the Burlington or some other railroad and take the top part off, and then they'd fabricate those skips and create rock cars. And they also maintained their steam locomotives. They had a complete, comprehensive machine shop. And they also maintained all the working equipment within the cement plant itself. It was quite an operation. Yes, sir.
Was there a siding between the plant and the quarry, or did they just have a couple of tracks at the quarry to get 2 trains past each other?
In the early years, they had a siding out at the quarry. In later years, they built another passing siding down just short of that bridge over the Republican River. And the way they kept the trains from not smashing into each other was the empty train, when it got done dumping rock, pulled down into the passing siding and waited for the loaded train to go by, and then it could go back to the quarry. Okay? Anybody else? Diane?
So is your lifelong passion for railroads, did it start with the littlest railroad?
I didn't discover that railroad until, maybe I was about 10 or 12 years old.
Well, that's pretty lifelong.
Yeah. I kid people, and I tell them, and it's a true story. I learned to read by watching railroad boxcars. My mother, who was the best mother anybody could ever have, found that by taking her little restless son out in the afternoon, she could keep him occupied if we took a drive down to the railroad yards. And of course, what I did was, I'd see a boxcar that had the big railroad logos on them, and I'd say, "What's that?" And she'd say, "Burlington route." "What's that?" "Union Pacific." "What's that?" "Pennsylvania Railroad." "What's that?" "Missouri Pacific." And I absorbed all of that. And one day a train went by and I'm sitting there and I said, "Union Pacific, Burlington route, Southern Pacific." So I learned to read by looking at the size of boxcars. And it has been a lifelong passion. It's been a very satisfying one. I think I've taken about all the questions that we can because of the constraints of the camera and the filming. So I just want to reiterate that my book is available at the gift shop here at the museum, and I will remain after the camera goes off and spend as much time as you'd like, answer any other questions any of you might have. Once again, thanks for coming. I've enjoyed it. It's been fun for me, and I certainly hope you've learned a little something, and you'll learn a lot more, when you get the book itself, because there are a lot of photographs, a lot of things in there that we couldn't cover because of the constraints of time. So thank you all.